So hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of the Underground. We are a free, pluralistic, and transnational university and charity founded in 2017 in the basement of a nightclub in Amsterdam. I am Naum, the head of program of I Want to Believe, an investigation into religion and belief systems. And today I would like to welcome our researchers and our visiting participants. So if you're joining this session or watching this video, I would like to ask you to kindly support this program and donate as much as you want and are able to do through our website. And today we'll have a 40-minute long talk followed by a 15-minute Q&A with our special guest, Verity Birt. So Verity is a funded practice-based PhD researcher at Northumbria University and the Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art in Newcastle upon Tyne, in the UK. Situated in the intersectional feminism, Verity's interdisciplinary practice of writing, performance, sculpture, sound, and filmmaking seeks to materialize enchanted encounters and meaningful intimacies between each other and the more than human world. Her PhD is currently titled Re-enchanting the World, a feminist symbiosis, and experiments with collaborative processes of making with in search of a joyful, recuperative, and reparative aesthetic and social practice. So welcome, Verity. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? That's my kind of standard artist bio / academic jargon. I'm an artist, but I'm also doing a PhD, so I'm in a bit of a kind of intense zone at the moment. I'm not sure what everyone else is doing at the moment, because I think what really drew me to do this talk for you guys today was that it's a kind of pluralistic academy, I suppose, and I really like that idea because I think I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, and I'm a very curious person, and I like to sort of mash up my research interests and see how those things collide and integrate. And I think as an artist, it's sort of the only place left where you can bring in so many different things together and process them. What I've really struggled with in my previous kind of education, university institution education systems, is you're kind of pushed away. Artists are kept quite separate to different disciplines, and I think that's a real shame. I think it's really interesting when everyone can have conversations, with artists and within politics, within people studying English literature and all sorts of things, drama, theatre, and experimental things. So it's where those worlds collide, I think, is the most interesting, where the most interesting things happen. So today, just as I guess a caveat, I would say I'm not an expert. I sort of believe in like radical amateurism. So like I do everything with a passion rather than a kind of professionalism. And so I'm covering a lot of bases today, but trying to keep it confined within the subject of re-enchantment. So I've actually written, I've kind of used a chapter of my PhD to kind of keep me on track within the 40 minutes, because it's not that much time and it's a really broad subject. And that's why it's so exciting, because so many different people are kind of looking at it from feminist, philosophy, ecology, sciences, and things like that. So I'm going to try and bring in quite a lot of references. And I think it's with the handout, you guys got like a reading list. There's so many different ways you can kind of take it. So it is quite a general look at the subject of re-enchantment towards a Gaian theology or theology. So just to define those terms, theology is a feminist, I guess, interpretation of theology. So it's looking at kind of more of a pantheon or a kind of queer feminist perspective on more patriarchal kind of religions. and that's a whole kind of other area of scholarship, but I thought I'd mention that to begin with. So it's mostly, the talk I'm going to do is mostly to do with re-enchantment, but that it's kind of opening out into a Gaian theology as something that I'm exploring in my own practice. But I guess we'll cross that bridge when I come to it. So I'm going to do a slideshow of lots of images and just sort of talk over them so you guys can kind of zone out into the images a bit, because there's a lot of information about to come your way. So I'm going to share my screen. Am I able to do that?
Yes, it should be all right.
Share screen. Okay, I've got two screens, so hopefully it's going to go to the right one. Share that one. Oh, right. Okay, which screen can you see?
We can see the I don't know, the PowerPoint, I guess, with all the slides on the left.
Yes, great. Okay, that's great. So I'll go into, where is it? View, isn't it? I'll just do paper and start. Okay. So I haven't actually written or where the images are from, and I'm happy to provide a kind of image list to you guys if you want to email me afterwards. So I feel like I'm going to kind of read this in a little bit of an immersive way to begin with. So using different voices, from like dream to kind of personal reflection to more kind of academic writing. But yeah, I just like the images just being kind of on their own for this. Okay, so I will begin. I'm just going to hide my own view. So much like Zoom. Let me just fix this all out here. Hide self view. Okay. The dim light throws shadows, and I stumble attempting to traverse the tangled roots, knotted together in a tunneling wreath of woven branches, of twisted and gnarled oak and beech. I trip as I attempt to pick my way through the ladder of roots, not wanting to damage them. Blackbirds sound their evening alarms. The dusk calls all to roost. I must get to the end of the path before it gets too dark. I look down to navigate my hesitant step, and the roots soften and transform into twisting snakes, wrapping themselves affectionately around my ankles, supporting me. I bend down and protectively scoop them up, offering them back to the trees to become root once again. Lockdown stretches through the summer, and little changes. Everything is suspended, waiting. My studio is shut, along with all pubs, libraries, schools, and places of work. Socializing with other people is prohibited, so I seek out non-human beings to spend time with. Up on the moors, the grouse exclaim at my passing, and the lapwings whine an eerie siren. The sheep are lambing and seek shade from the spring sunshine against tumbled dry stone walls. A hardy upland breed, they keep their fleeces throughout the summer, which organically get teased off by the gorse and bramble. Straggles of fleece decorate the shrubs like unkept beards. I smell the sap rising from the conifer plantation, carried on the warm wind. The scent comforts me, peppery and dense, stimulating a montage of images and emotions, sky and shade, reverie, longing, green, purple, and blood red. Entering the forest, it takes a while for my eyes to adjust. Sunlight struggles through a thick roof of dark green and dapples the forest floor. Neatly carpeted with pine needles. It's still, it's very still, any breath of wind protectively muffled by the hugging conifers. The scent intensifies. The trees are weeping from their lower limbs. Ants, shield bugs, and mosquitoes gather around the sweet ooze, which threatens to submerge their fragile bodies. The sap crystallizes and crusts as it navigates the bark's crevices. I pick at it, scraping off a nodule, and it sinks under my fingernail and lines my cuticle. a rubbery golden gloop collecting debris. Our bodies coalesce. I walk back to the village via my allotment, which backs onto the medieval church's graveyard. There's always something to do here, a beckoning for participation. Robins and blackbirds keep me company as I dig through manure to prepare the vegetable beds for seedlings. Poppies, mallow, and campions spread through the areas unturned, and I leave them to take residence, trying to refrain from weeding. A slow worm, recently awakened, suns itself on the hot earth. The rich air radiating from my manure pile allures flies, insects, and worms, inviting blue tits and wagtails to join my community. I plant runner beans, cabbages, and broccoli, potatoes, onions, and courgettes. The veg resides in half of the allotment, the other half left wild and untamed. As summer progresses, I fight the urge to tidy the beds from intruding thistles, and am rewarded by parties of butterflies, iridescent dock beetles, and ladybirds. A drone of buzzing reverberates from the bells of Corinth, as the foraging bees vibrate their wings to shake the pollen from the anthers. Loaded with yellow dust, they visit the neighboring bean vines and potato plants, pollinating generously. Cabbage whites start to waft around the patch, and soon the brassicas are draped with trails of eggs. Between the densely packed folds of leaves, young caterpillars nibble their way across the dome. A well-known pest to crops, this small caterpillar has followed human trade routes for centuries. After observing their interactions with the cabbage, I'm reassured by the plant's natural defense. Generously packed foliage allows 2 or 3 leaves spare for the caterpillars while still providing plenty for me. I wonder at their soft green bodies rippling along the cabbage's vibrant purple veins. Soon they will metamorphose, changing form and colour. These strange expressions of life enchant me. Enchantment is transformative. It is tied up with feelings of wonder, awe, and reverence, or the feeling of magic. Magic, as David Abram explains, is a relation to the mysterious and the sacred, which is fully immanent in the material world. This is not, Abram claims, a transcendent realm which is radically outside the world in which our bodies and our bodily senses give us access. Rather, magic is a sense of permeating and pulsing within everything we encounter with our animal senses, a fully immanent and embodied encounter of the sacred. So enchantment moves us not into another world, but joyfully, magically into the one we already inhabit, an immanent exchange and intimacy shared with everything around and within us. This is less a transcendental phenomenon, a going elsewhere, but more an earthly and material encounter where boundaries are crossed and it feels wonderful and exhilarating. Jane Bennett's notion of radical permeability as crossings in the enchantment of modern life function as sites of enchantment and play a role in cultivating a generosity towards the animals, vegetables, and minerals in one's field of encounter. Bennett claims this radical permeability extends across everything: non-human animals, wind, rocks, trees, plants, tools, and machines. And I quote, "Crossings have the power to enchant. Their magic resides in their mobility, that is, their capacity to travel, fly, or transform themselves, in their morphing transits, primate towards other primate, terrestrial towards solar, silicon towards carbon, living towards dead, and towards new formations exterior to the relation between each of these sets of terms. Metamorphing creatures enact the very possibility of change. Their presence carries with it the trace of dangerous, but also exciting and exhilarating migrations." So enchantment is the movement of magic, an earthy material force of transformation, change, and metamorphosis. Here the identified and the ordered slips into the unknown, the wondrous and the mysterious. This unfolding, mutating force undermines static boundaries, and borders become porous, contaminating categories and birthing something in between. This in-betweenness, or continuous transitioning, is always moving, lively, and therefore liberated and uncapturable. Not only do the cabbage whites offer a magical embodiment of this metamorphosis, but also remind us this process of mutability is happening within us all the time, through our skin, the air we breathe, and the water we drink. Like Ursula Le Guin's carrier bag in her carrier bag theory of fiction, our boundaries are forever leaking, continuously gathering things in and spilling things out. Moving away from the Enlightenment's categorization of nature as that which is over there and separate to humans, othered by systems of science and religion to dominate and control, I seek to be radically permeated by life of all kinds, ever shifting and transforming into the experimental and unknown. This resists Western humanities' mechanistic binaries to ultimately control fear of the unknown with calculability and consequently eradicate the fluctuating process of life through upholding the concept of the self, a singular, agential, mechanistic, and contained unit. Bennett's call for re-enchantment is in direct response to German sociologist Max Weber's famous account of modernity's demagification or disenchantment. Weber's argument is that the modern worldview understands the cosmos to have been emptied of any intrinsic spiritual, symbolic, or expressive power, eradicating an ancient cosmology within which human existence found its meaning and purpose. Instead, the world is now seen in terms of neutral facts, the detached rational understanding of which will give white Western man the power to explain, predict, and thereby control and manipulate the world. And I quote, this is Bieber, there is no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, but rather that one can, in principle, master all things by calculation. This means that the world is disenchanted. This process of Western enlightenment split humanity from the rest of nature and the cosmos, and in doing so, liberated man from his earthly responsibilities. So just as a footnote to his, basically, I'm following Rosie Bradotti, another post-humanist here, by being specific, by identifying who the Enlightenment project was emancipating, which is namely European, white, male, urban, and able-bodied. So disenchantment has also been deemed by philosopher Charles Taylor as the making of modern identity through a neutralizing of the cosmos. It can no longer be seen as the embodiment of a meaningful order which can define the good for us. Through objectifying the world, we empower the human, generating a detached, self-defining individual subject whose meaning has now got to come not from interrelations with the world beyond, but purely from within. Philosopher Richard Tarnas warns us that the psychology of the individual modern self supercharges the will to power as it legitimizes dominance and desensitizes empathy to the other. It even reflects back on how we see ourselves as fixed and mechanistic. Feminist scholar Silvia Federici, in her seminal work, Caliban and the Witch, traces this early modern process of disenchantment and its entanglement with the contemporaneous genocide of women in the witch trials and privatization of the commons. She also highlights how this modernization process and its eradication of a holistic magical worldview upheld historically by women as medicinal healers and carers enabled oppressive hierarchical systems such as capitalism to flourish. And I quote Federici, aiming at controlling nature, the capitalist organization of work must refuse the unpredictability implicit in the practice of magic and the possibility of establishing a privileged relation with natural elements. Magic was an instrument of grassroots resistance to power. The world had to be disenchanted in order to be dominated. Modernity sought to center the white male as progressive pinnacle of humanity. And to reach these divine heights, humanity needed to sever its connection and interaction with the lowly earth, its cosmology, and the unpredictable forces of the natural world. Modernity's myths of mind-body dualisms and mechanistic contained individuals still dominates Western culture today. Although research in the natural sciences and quantum physics is beginning to radically shift our concepts of autonomy. Cross-disciplinary feminist theorist Karen Barrett's notion of intra-action replacing interaction also works to erode and permeate the edges of the contained individual. In Meeting the Universe Halfway, Barrett's research across quantum and theoretical physics and biology suggests human agency is not an inherent property of a pre-established body, but rather an active process of ongoing exchange between things, a dynamism of forces. Interaction complicates the Enlightenment ideals of agency and objectivity and implicates a situated, entangled, and emergent ontology, one in which we participate within a vibrant, entangled world. Consider whether you're a human being, an insect, a microbe, or a stone, this verse is true. All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. That is by Octavia Butler in the parable of the sower. Myself as individual begins to dissolve and echo through the beings of others. The hair on my body is like the down on a leaf and the bristles on the unfolding limbs of a fern. An emotional empathy is developing through an acknowledgement of shared attributes and likeness. But this does not negate or erase radical difference, but rather enhances it, cultivating respect and awe for a being I can never truly understand or inhabit. This moment of reverence is produced when the polarities of spiritual and material collapse and co-create as intra-action, or more acutely, divine contact. As Elvia Wilkes suggests, following Simone Weil, the premise for divine contact is active deconstruction of the self when becoming one with the environment. The self dissolves, but the self is also always everywhere. Through this annihilation of self and decreation of our sharp anthropo edges, we can acknowledge everything's subjectivity. Through this processual and ongoing transformation, we can reform as an integrated but never absolute whole. However, Wilke also warns that self-annihilation or radical porosity could also be the dystopic version of insanity, leading to a total and horrific loss of identity. Some of us, like some of us, the non-human world may not desire to coalesce, most of them equipped with their own defenses and set of boundaries. In the current era of viral pandemics and COVID-19, we are acutely reminded that one of the most successful organisms' interactions with us could also be our last. Western civilization has been in steady flight from the body and embodiment because, in David Abrams' words, it's not a nice world, it's an outrageously beautiful one, but it ain't pretty. The embodied and interactive world is laced with shadow, predation, aching loss, and grief. But without that, there is also no joy. Abram emphasizes that we must cultivate a radical vulnerability and openness to the friction and difficulty in life to enable deep wonder and astonishment at its magic. Participating with the world, with all our animal senses open and receptive, often triggers a horror of its wild monstrosity and visceral horror. But this objection could be the affect of passing through a threshold, a crossing into worlds within worlds within worlds, a sympoiesis, an integrated ontology and theology with the more than human cosmos. Willow sticks abound into makeshift tripods, becoming animistic, three-legged totems. Feathers, bones, and discarded contact lens cases are thread onto paracord to form a necklace, draped onto the structure like an offering. An antler and ram's horn are bound onto the ends of crossed poles with elastic bands, stained rags, and zip ties, signalling a warning. A docked lamb's tail dangles between the legs of the tripod, obscured by a skin-like wrapping of latex. Bundles of heather, rubber tire, and feathers are draped over this, an offering from a ritual or good luck charm. Under the soft feathers, the hidden glint of a large knife or billhook. Psychedelic runner beans are piled up over purple fluorite crystals and the dried flower heads of heather. Hanging in the window, large wilted purple cabbage leaves, leathery and veined, look like elephant ears or primordial megafauna. These are sculptures by Tom Sewell, my partner in Life and Lockdown. All these materials were gleaned from beings in our landscape, beings we cultivated, foraged, and cohabited with. Shining through these structures is a film projected onto the back wall of the gallery. Wide-angle scenes from Northumberland's vast landscape are overlapped with extreme micro close-ups of caterpillars digesting leaves, hands plunging into rock pools, divine images by William Blake, and Anglo-Saxon carvings depicting the fall of man. This installation was in communion with the landscape in which we were embedded throughout 2020. A year like no other allowed many of us to be immersed in a shifting reality, a new normal. Birdsong was amplified, space was emptied of human activity. Goats in Wales started to infiltrate urban architecture. Our systems glitched. We were provided with a rupture in which to see the world in a different way, space for reflection and observation, politically and personally. The mutating virus is part of an entangled life system which doesn't live by our fixed identities and defended borders. Its fluidity and mutability is key to its success. Through upsetting the ecological balance of the planet, we have provided a fertile environment for a virus such as COVID-19 to flourish. In the West, many people have been working on reparations for the wrongs done throughout our history, not only to other cultures, but also to our own. The dominance of white Western supremacy is damaging every human and being in this planet. A cross-disciplinary group of chemists, biologists, philosophers, artists, scholars have been seeking a more holistic narrative and trajectory for a humble and recuperative Western culture, which, as Donna Haraway puts it, works with the trouble of the past to take accountability and grow from. Whoops. The Gaia Hypothesis is one such narrative. Originally developed by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis as a scientific hypothesis in the 1970s. It names, I'll quote Lovelock here, complex nonlinear couplings between processes that compose and sustain entwined but non-additive subsystems as a partially cohering systemic whole, aka the Earth is alive. Countering the mighty human-centered, epoch-defining Anthropocene, Gaia does not privilege human or other biological beings' intentions, desires, or needs, but puts into question our very existence. We who have provoked its interactions that threatens both human and non-human livable presents and futures. Gaia is an intrusive event that undoes thinking as usual. In scientist and philosopher Isabel Stenger's words, she is what specifically questions the tales and refrains of modern history. There is only one real mystery at stake here. It is the answer we, meaning those who belong to this history, may be able to create as we face the consequences of what we have provoked. Named by author William Golding after the ancient chthonic goddess of the earth. I say goddess here as Gaia was gender fluid in pre-Olympian Greek mythology. So they, she/they, in Haraway's terms, are maker and destroyer, not resource to be exploited or ward to be protected, or nursing mother promising nourishment. Gaia is not a person, but complex systemic phenomena that compose a living planet. Gaia's intrusion into our affairs is a radically materialist event, threatening not all life on Earth, as microbes will adapt, but threatens the livability of Earth for vast kinds of species, an event already underway called the Sixth Great Extinction. But Gaia also offers us a belief system, a theology, way to process, figure, and respect the chaos of this natural event and its subsequent forces, which thinkers such as Timothy Morton have termed a hyper-object, too big and complex for us to conceptualize, leading to overwhelming stress, dubbed eco-anxiety. Gaia also integrates and collapses the binaries of spiritual and material, manifesting in ancient art and culture as something monstrously in between, a threshold between beings and worlds. Gaia is also often theromorphic, shifting between and combining multiple species, bodies, and genders. It's also helpful to be reminded of ourselves as one such species, one of the great apes, animals among animals. As philosopher Mary Midgley reminds us when we wrestle with concerns of anthropocentrism or eco-fascism, the point is not that we humans are insignificant. Indeed, human concerns must necessarily be of great importance for us. It is that all other creatures are significant too. Gaia is a relic of Western pre-patriarchal civilization, a civilization of reciprocity, egalitarianism, and integration with the modern human world, as argued by archaeologist Maria Gimbutas. Gaia was the oldest of the Western pantheon and relegated by Apollo and the Olympians to the chthonic underworld when humanity looked skyward for its salvation. Instead of integrated balance, the new Olympian gods stood for order against chaos, reason against feeling, the masculine against the feminine. These binaries solidified through the Western world over centuries and enabled our current worldview, but this view is now destroying us all. A magical and material entity, Gaia goes some way to produce reverence, meaning, and very real connection with the natural world, with all its horrors and wonders. retain mystery through ancient myths, temporal obscurity. Gaia is uncapturable, more than a human, and has many faces throughout a shared but deviant human culture, an expressive universe that moves according to a diverse logic, very different from the logic we attempt to impose. Perhaps she, they, could help us now, as we process these difficult times, when we're very much in need of new myths, or perhaps, in a non-linear temporality, ancient ones. So I'm going to tie it up here, because I can't, if I open the kind of Gaian box, there's so much to say, and it's kind of probably another hour's worth. So I'm going to probably leave it for a discussion. I think that would be more helpful, if that works for everybody else. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Verity, for this also very performative talk. So yeah, anyone has questions? Dear researchers. What, I mean, okay, well, people there, guys, please, otherwise I will use my random selector. Well, I have a, yeah, I don't even know how to articulate this. I mean, for many years I was deeply invested in researching about re-enchantment of the world, and certainly it's something that happens in our Western cultures, that as science became the predominant way of understanding the world. We, as Max Weber said, no, we lost the magic. But are you aware of any cultures around the world that have able to preserve that enchantment? I mean, of course, many indigenous traditions and wisdoms, they always nurture that magical value. But today, are there any cultures that are keeping that intact? I'm just curious.
I think that, because I as a kind of white European woman, like I'm really kind of eager to find the residues, I guess, of a kind of indigenous integrated cosmology that kind of predated a kind of patriarchal, rational, and colonial, I guess, cosmology. And so I've been quite careful not to kind of co-opt or appropriate, because there's so many overlaps in indigenous cosmologies, I guess. And so and I think a lot of kind of white Western people really kind of try and hold like yoga and Eastern religions and things like that, and they're so kind of desperate for them in their Western culture. And I guess I've kind of tried to find something within that's still kind of there in a kind of Western culture, in the history books, or not so much in the history books, because it's quite hard to find a lot of stuff about Gaia, because Apollo kind of took over, Zeus and Apollo kind of took over her domain, but this is a whole, like, I guess, history lesson, or ancient history lesson. But I think where the kind of residual indigenous enchanted cosmologies, they're carried often as oral traditions or within art, and so it's almost like decoding a lot of kind of art and finding that a lot of sculpture and painting and just pottery and stuff like that, they're these relics of symbols that represented things, and the meaning, I guess, has been lost over time, or not, or kind of resides in songs and dance and the arts. And I think that's what excites me, because I think there's so many kind of hidden signs in these objects across culture, and they're shared as well, and there's lots of overlaps between ancient Greek, Central European kind of cosmology and Eastern cosmologies, because when obviously we were migrating across the earth, like these kind of stories and mythologies were carried with peoples as they migrated and kind of dispersed among so many different cultures and then adapted. And those things still reside in kind of fragments of art and culture and song. So, I mean, that's what excites me about being an artist and kind of also looking at history, but also, yeah, like material culture, I suppose. And you can see like in frescoes in Pompeii, there's like these representations of Gaia's tomb, for instance, which is the omphalos, which is this kind of very kind of strange object, which is covered in a net, which a lot of feminist kind of scholars have been suggesting symbolizes this kind of interconnectedness of wisdom. And it was worn by, it's on statues of kind of soothsayers and oracles that would have this kind of vast knowledge. And so there's all these kind of symbols there to be interpreted that you can kind of trace in poetry, like ancient Greek poetry and plays. But because they were so metaphorical and kind of artistic and poetic, they're open to so many interpretations, which makes it really exciting because anyone can use it then, I suppose. And imaginatively, it's a really useful material to work in that field, because you can kind of take what you need or like share knowledge and put different things together. But it is kind of like code breaking, I guess. But yeah, I think with Western, because I guess it's obvious that all these sort of re-enchantment and interconnection with landscape and a feeling of kind of deep integration and non-linear time, all these things are very embedded in indigenous cultures, but Western culture has eradicated it, and that's why it's become so toxic, I think.
Yep.
So yeah, I think for me it's like, well, how like white Western culture is so toxic, like where did it go so wrong? And like tracing those threads back, I suppose, to looking at kind of the history of mythology, especially in Western culture, and trying to find fragments of those myths that's still there if you look for them, basically.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, now there are questions, so cool. Let's go with them. So Eden, please.
Yeah, I'm just gonna read my question because I was really excited when you were talking about how Gaia is able to help us today. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on it. Like it could be a really small summarization as well. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I came to the Gaia Hypothesis through Mary Midgley, who's a philosopher, British philosopher who she isn't that well known, or she's not really taught because she was a woman, I suppose, and she died a couple of years ago. But she wrote a lot about, so the Gaia Hypothesis was really within the sciences since the 70s, and there wasn't much, there was a little bit of leakage, I suppose, into philosophy. So Mary Midgley was writing about how think about the fact that the universe or the planet is alive, or it's one. It's not necessarily conscious. I think this is a bit of a sort of overlap. Some panpsychism is where there's a belief that it means actually that everything has a consciousness and it's a shared consciousness. But Gaian is that I guess it's more like an ecosystem. Everything is entangled and it's like a chain reaction. So if you take one thing out, it will affect everything else. But Mary Midgley, specifically her, thinks about Gaian thinking. So how this idea of interconnectedness can help us think about the way we live, or think about morals, think about ethics. And so it's really interesting coming at it through philosophy or a way of being or a cosmology. I guess it sort of integrates a more rational and scientific understanding with one which is really like radically magical as well. And that's where I think, because I'm quite a rational thinker, it's a kind of worldview or a way of thinking which makes sense for me to integrate. I guess if you've grown up with a Western education, which is rational and enlightened, it's hard to then reject all of that and start from scratch and be completely immersed in a magical world. You know, it's kind of, some could say it's kind of impossible if you've grown up with a kind of Western education, a modern Western education. But to integrate or to try and sort of adapt your thinking, or just practice, I think that's the thing, practice participation in an interconnected world, to think about yourself in a way that is kind of annihilated, I suppose, if you want to go into it philosophically. That helps me kind of undo some of the rational thinking. So there's one guy called David Seagal. I'm not sure if anyone has heard of him, but he's a great kind of young philosopher at the moment, looking at like this kind of integrated cosmology, working with Gaian theory, working with sort of systems theory and stuff. So systems is this, it's kind of come from Gaia theory, where everything is a processual system. It's not linear hierarchical. It's like everything happening at the same time. It's quite chaotic. And he has done some really amazing, very accessible lectures on, he's got a blog called Footnotes to Plato. And he's a philosopher, and he's very, very good and very clear at explaining what it could do for us now, like how it can kind of help us think about the world in a different way. And also how that supports and I guess facilitates like empathy and care as well as part of that. But I think, yeah, because it's funny because I'm an artist, I suppose. I feel like I'm bringing loads of things into a practice and seeing how they all interrelate, which I guess that as a practice is a Gaian practice, because it's very much about everything being part of everything else. So it's the way I work, it makes sense in a kind of Gaian theology in a way, as a Gaian practice, a Gaian way of thinking, as a way of being, multidisciplinary, non-linear, like quite chaotic. That kind of undoes like a modern, linear, individual worldview or cosmology, I think.
Thank you. Can you type his name by any chance?
Yes, yeah, I can, yeah. Is it Matthew Seagal? Let me just check.
It's Matthew David Seagal. I think this is the website.
Oh, thank you. Yes, that's it, yeah. He also lectures at Schumacher College, which is, they do loads of free talks as well. It's based in the UK. It's like a holistic science college based in the countryside.
Good. Okay, so the next one, Ruth.
Yeah, you just you answered my question basically, because I was thinking, wondering if you had any references to people you're trying to marry, like using still analytical thought, because of course it's still useful with magical thinking. But I think you answered that with David Seagal.
Yeah, there's I think in feminist stuff at the moment is the biggest kind of cross-disciplinary soup, I suppose. So yeah, like thinkers like Donna Haraway is really good at sort of bringing in creative thinking and also being quite a bad academic. So she's very like reputed, I suppose, now, but she sort of tries to be a bit of a kind of like, she doesn't reference properly, or like she's a bit of a, well, she's a radical, I suppose. Like she does all sorts of things. She works with video filmmakers and stuff, and crosses boundaries. Yeah, I mean, there's so, because I did like a, I don't know if you guys had the kind of resource list, because I did like a big reading list thing with lots of, but I think it's all been mixed up in one giant resource list, hasn't it? But that's kind of the best place to go for the references, I think. Unless there's anything specific, I can, if you want to ask if there's anything like specific, then I can think of somebody that would be helpful.
Okay, I'm just checking if we have the references in our calendar.
Is it like a hand, like
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can make
because I can probably see which
good.
one. I mean, David Abram is really great. Very accessible.
Always next to me, I have to say.
What? Sorry.
Always next to me, David Abram.
Yeah. It's so good. There's also this series is really good. It's the Cambridge University did a really great series on magic and ecology, which are bringing in lots of stuff about Gaia and re-enchantment and stuff. I'll just put a link to their YouTube channel. Don't autoplay in the chat. That's really great. There's a couple. Is that, maybe that's not the right. Let me just Google that. Yeah, I did. I think I put it on links, maybe on that handout you guys got. Let me see.
We're in so.
Right, here it is. Got so many tabs open. Yeah, so David Abram in that conversation for Crash was really interesting. It's when, I guess now it's where the sort of sciences and ecology are overlapping with theology and belief, and trying to bring spiritualism back into kind of, because it was so relegated, I guess, and the binaries of science and spirit were completely divorced through the Enlightenment. Whereas now there's scientists, I guess, trying to sort of think about that in a different way and bring it back in to a kind of holistic practice. And Abram, I think, sits on he's quite a good kind of mediator for those ideas.
Right. Okay, Karen.
I'm just going to read it because otherwise I might get lost. But you talked a lot about enchantment related to nature and to actually being in those natural kind of like forest environments. But do you feel like the built kind of like city concrete environments that are very processed elements from nature can still hold this sort of enchantment, and that they like really move away from this kind of, you know, changing and metamorphosis that is very present in nature?
I think that's something, because I've lived equally in London in a very urban space and in the middle of nowhere. Like half of my life was like in the middle of nowhere in the countryside, and half was in London. And I think it's funny to watch the wrestling of like the sort of but I say humanity, but I mean like patriarchy, really, like patriarchy and capitalism, the material of kind of suppressing nature and keeping everything kind of flat and straight and like linear, to keep reminding us every day that this is the way humanity is, you know. And it's this kind of, I found it quite interesting where you get these fractures in those realities. So yeah, like when you have the goats kind of coming into a rural space or something, or you get like a space in between maybe like building sites where you get a kind of rupture in the concrete, you know, where I think it's a case of like any type of reality shattering, only if it's for a minute. It's a glitch, and I think in any sort of situation or material situation or architecture, you suddenly get an opportunity to kind of not think as usual, as Donna Haraway says, like something changes and you realize, oh, this isn't like how it has to be. But I guess like, Jane Bennett actually is really great. So Re-enchantment of, there's a book, I was referencing Jane Bennett a lot, but there's this book which is The Enchantment of Modern Life. And she goes into talking about basically like how our, I guess, attachments to the natural world through a kind of agrarian civilization of being very much involved with the land, then got kind of pasted onto synthetic attachments, and how like capitalism captures that. So capitalism is a way to sort of capture our enchantment with like objects, because we're so like drawn to like shiny new things, and it's a very ancient thing that we did with like butterflies or with flowers, you know, but they just sort of like appropriated or that mechanism that we have and produce things to kind of use those same devices, I suppose. And it's just like, it's the same kind of feeling as you would get from getting like a new pair of trainers or something, if you kind of get like some runner beans growing or whatever. It's just like this kind of flood of endorphins. But Jane Bennett writes about that actually, and writes about like urban spaces, capitalism, the kind of shininess and the newness of like the city and the urban space, and how that's, I guess, been produced to sort of, yeah, to sort of tap into those kind of very primordial sort of, because I guess like it's really, when you're thinking of evolution, our bodies and our physiologies and our way of thinking hasn't changed at all since we're hunter-gatherers. Like nothing's changed in us, and we have a very ancient way of navigating the world, but different signs and signals just overlap each other and sort of take the place of other things, but you can swap them out at any time. So it's like, it's quite funny when you think of it like that, of how like, yeah, sort of like shiny trainers is the same thing as seeing like some crystals in the river or whatever. It's just like, it's tapping into the same sort of feelings of enchantment. And it's not, I think it's really interesting to be like, it's not that that's like evil, but I think it's manipulative, you know. It's not like capitalism and an evil force, but it's that no one really tells you that it's an addictive sort of form of capturing attention, and it's very manipulative, and it's a very human, I guess, Achilles heel to be seduced by things like that, especially in an urban environment. But yeah, more on that, definitely go to Jane Bennett, because she writes a lot about that, so it's really interesting.
Okay, and let's try to squeeze in one last question. Rachel.
Hello, thanks for your talk. I thought it was so interesting, and I've been looking in my project about at lots of the same references as you, but I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on any like practical steps of how we integrate or educate these ideas of enchantment into like everyday life, especially within like inner cities, and also just like less privileged spaces.
Yeah, exactly. I think so I've read a few things about this, because I've also been I think being an artist, I'm in a privileged position where I get to sort of create connections with objects, materials, and aesthetics as a daily practice in a studio space. So my workspace is filled with kind of things that I'm seduced by, and images and sort of like textures and things like that. And that, I guess, kind of produces an awareness of these things also in nature, and awareness of these things in, it can be, because so there's another whole argument about what we define as nature. So I think it's useful. I know I've used, because I've used examples from the natural world, I suppose, because I was in lockdown in the middle of nowhere. So I was using that as a kind of a storytelling device, I suppose. But an urban space is also a natural space, it still exists in nature. So there's, again, a kind of thinking of nature as over there and in the countryside is an enlightenment way of thinking. So an urban space is also nature, and nature has produced us, and we have produced urban spaces. But that kind of it's a bit of a kind of head fuck, actually, when you go into it, you're like, what's real? So going back to what you were saying, the practice, there's a couple of things. I think sort of practicing an emotional connection with things. There's a magician / witch, Josephine McCarthy, who talks about using language and communication to literally talk to objects in your room and talk to objects you walk past, like just under your breath, to create like an emotional connection with them. And if you do that often, like you walk past a bit of pavement, or you walk past like a sign on the floor or whatever that's there all the time, or you kind of just like, hey sign, like just create a kind of friendship with it. And yeah, it can be a plant. I find it really easy with plants. I'm always talking to my house plants, and it's like, now they're sort of animate, because you sort of bring a character into them, and they sort of like it's also exercising your imagination. That's really important. Like just by sort of projecting or not projecting, or just creating a kind of animate being in different objects. It's not necessarily personifying them. I think there's a bit of a kind of gray area about that, but it starts to create a kind of attention to things, but attention through empathy and emotion. And that can then kind of echo, if you're practicing that all the time, every day, in little moments, like even if it's with your sharpener or your pencil that you're using all the time, give it a name, and like, and that will start to kind of change your worldview, like gradually, and it will practice empathy with things. And that's really interesting, I think, in the sort of practice of Wicca, when you name things and give things agency, that sort of creates a way of feeling integrated in a space as well. If you're moving house or something, to go around and kind of name things, different things, and sort of really get to know like the corner of the room, or like a bit of your carpet or a house plant, it can start to make you feel more relational, I suppose, with everything. And that, I find that really comforting. Does that make sense?
Excellent. So I think we're coming to the end of the lecture. So Verity, if anyone would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
Yeah, Instagram. I'm on Instagram. Email. Yeah, if you had also, because I use so many images, a lot of them were mine from film stills and stuff, and my research. And so a lot of them were paintings that I haven't credited. So if you had any sort of, I can send you the slides. If there are paintings you really liked in there or whatever, I can let you know what they are. I can write my email address here.
Yes, please. That would be awesome.
Yeah. There you go.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I can also give, if any of you guys are like working with images, paintings, art, and want to sort of look into that more, I can definitely help out with that too.
Okay, great. I think Teresa will definitely like the slides.
Yeah.
So
no problem.
Yeah, I mean, you can send it to us and I will forward them to everyone.
Okay, great. Yeah, I can do that.
Cool. Fantastic. So Verity, thanks so much for joining us today in the University of the Underground. And yeah, to everyone else, yeah, have a lovely evening, rest of the day, night, wherever you are. And see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Ciao, ciao.